I showed a foil like that once. It's a clever chap in the front row said, there's an error in the top right corner.
Was he serious?
Oh, of course not. It was a humorous comment on the nature of such slides.
I have to remember that.
Yes.
How many storage was delayed? Looks like 3 delayed. Did you have the COT? Yes.
On high game.
Yeah, it's because it's getting biased off by the strong light from there. When you want to do a face one, you've got to come in closer. That's fine. You have a look at that now. It's being biased off by the light from there. If I stand there now, you see it all.
Yeah.
The auto gain gets pushed off by the bright light from there. Which you have to switch between those two in order to get the depth. You can get audience as well with that. Yeah.
Right, okay.
And your power pack's okay now, is it?
Yeah,
good.
Perfect. I'll put them on so I don't touch them.
Right, yeah.
There weren't many of us back in the early 2 weeks. The entire steering team one is just published about the history of computing. It's only been around for maybe a couple of years. This one, the first one I've seen, knowledge of actually switching from this to comparisons. Leo did. Leo got this.
Hello, how are you?
Hello, John. Fine, thank you. If you want to sit next to the cameraman, you can.
I'll sit just behind.
Give you a bit more scope to swing.
Yes, it's my usual job. I forget how many times I've done it.
That's the truth. Fly around
I
people.
thought it Yeah, we did, but we managed to lose one of them. Stuart was shooting off in what seemed to be entirely the wrong Actually, no, that was the last but one meeting I attended, I think. Because the last one I came to was the one, the Elliot one, where Stuart was here. Oh, I certainly mean. Because it was the one that did you come here? It's about too late to shave it off.
Your voice.
There is a
Oh, yes, me too. I've been at home 6 years.
See you whenever. I tried it today. It's no good as a
They used a few of those shops in the display.
That's a very good thing.
I've just been
I think that they will back By the way, that's blocking the sound.
I'll try and snort. There are some marketing. Make money out of it. They've got access to it.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this fourth annual one-day seminar of the Student Conservation Society. I'm Tony Sale, Secretary of the Society and your chairman for today. We have a full program of talks about early NPL and English electric computers from Turing to DEUCE. The domestic arrangements are that at 12:45 we break for lunch for an hour till 1:45. You are welcome to go out of the lecture theatre, through the space gallery, up the escalator to the first floor, and there is a snack bar there. And they've been pre-warned to expect a large number of people at that time to have a snack for lunch, coffee, sandwiches, whatever you like there. And the same arrangements will apply at 3:15 when we'll break for the tea. So, without more ado, I will now invite our first speaker to give us an introduction to the NPL and English electric computers, Donald Davis.
Thank you. Well, my story is going to begin with Turing and the influence that he had on the history of computing and particularly on the work done at NPL, which he originated, or he was the first designer, so to speak, on that particular project. I should go on to talk about the early stages of the work at NPL, and the others later on will fill in most of the detail about the engineering and so on, important part of today's seminar. So Alan Turing is widely recognized as a genius who made fundamental contributions to the foundations of mathematics, and then quite very important contributions to code breaking in World War II. That has been recorded in a magnificent biography by Andrew Hodges and in a play, even been a play, as you know, about the subject. But I'd like to just make a few remarks about the foundations of mathematics and Turing's significance there. I must apologize if I haven't got it all quite right. But it was concerned with a problem called the Entscheidung problem, which really just means the decision problem. It was called that because it was proposed by David Hilbert at an international congress in 1928. Hilbert had already done a lot of work on the foundations of mathematics, but he realized that there were three things that still remained to be done, and they were really a wish list for mathematics. They were to prove for some particular brand of formally described mathematics described in formal terms. That, by the way, was already well understood because Russell and White had, Principia Mathematica had been published. But he realized that there were sort of three loose ends that he would like to clear up. One was the question of completeness, which is that any well-formed assertion in this formal language could either be proved true or proved false. That would be very nice if it could happen. The second one was to ensure there was consistency, because if you can prove both a theorem and its opposite, then from that you can deduce everything. And so a system of mathematics that isn't consistent is pretty useless. Whereas completeness is desirable, consistency, of course, is essential. And it would be nice to be able to prove it for a particular brand of mathematics. The third thing is decidability, which means that given an assertion in some formal language, you can put that into a machine or put that through a formal process that's been predefined and which is finite in extent. That's to say, you know it will eventually reach a decision, and that decision will be this assertion is true or this assertion is false. Well, those are the three things that he proposed. And unfortunately for him, Kurt Gödel at the same conference produced his incompleteness theorem, which destroyed the first of those things by showing that if a brand of mathematics was both consistent and also contained enough to be able to generate the natural numbers, 0, 1, 2, 3, and so on, by means of Peano's postulates or something like that, then it could not be complete. That there must be assertions that you can write down which can neither be proved true nor proved false. So the first of Hilbert's wish list disappeared without trace right at the beginning. It left the question of decidability, but notes that it was now a slightly different question because assertions were now in three categories: provably true, provably false, and unprovable. So I don't claim to know exactly how Turing's work related to the Entscheidung's problem. It certainly made a big dent in it. Turing was concerned to show that there were numbers which could be defined perfectly well but could never be computed. And he was therefore concerned with the decidability problem. To him, this formal machine, which would in a finite number of operations arrive at a decision, had to be explained. You had to say what the formal machine was before you could begin to prove theorems about it. I should explain, of course, that Hilbert's formulation was an informal one. It was just sort of hand-waving. It had to be put into an actual formal statement before you could decide it, before you could prove or disprove any of his wish list. So, as regard to decidability, Turing had to come up with a way of describing formally what any conceivable machine or any conceivable procedure would look like. And in 1935, he had these ideas. My note, which I've got down, there will be copies after lunch, there actually says that the paper was published in 36. Actually, it was submitted to the London Mathematical Society and published in 37, called On Computable Numbers with an Application to the Entscheidung's Problem. Now, the title tells you what his real interest was, which was to decide just what a machine was capable of doing. All through his life, he was interested in this, and as you know, he worked on artificial intelligence and so on. He wanted to know what the limitations of the machine were. And to do this, he first had to define the machine, and this became the Turing machine, which is now used as the model for a computing process in all work on the foundations of mathematics, mathematical logic, and so on. The Turing machine looks a bit different from what we have today, but one thing, it could not use an address to access its store, its memory, because that would mean the memory had to have a finite size, and although this thing is finite, you don't know how big it's going to be to make a general purpose. A Turing machine, you have to have access to an unlimited amount of memory, not unlimited. So he used a tape with one end cut off, the other end going off as far as you need for the process, and symbols on the tape, and a finite state machine which could read a symbol, look up a configuration table which told it for that symbol and that state that it was in, what the next symbol and the next state would be, or indeed whether to move the machine left or right to the next operation. That's all it had to do. A very simple machine to describe, and he called this machine a Turing machine. Let's call it, well, he didn't, others to do, let's call it T. Now, that's not enough for our purpose because we have to be able to tell the machine what to do. So this was the important step that Turing made. He designed another Turing machine with a specific configuration table. So far I've talked about configuration tables in the abstract. His Turing machine had a specific configuration table which he wrote out at length in the paper, and that he calls U, the universal Turing machine, or universal computing machine. And it's such that when you take the configuration table of T and write it out in a language which he described, and put this on the tape in symbols that he defined, and then start the machine in the right way, it will chug about, and in a very long time, it will actually perform a simulation of it's actually an emulation of what machine T would have done. So you can put the symbols of machine T elsewhere on the tape, and it will chug around, and in due course it will perform exactly what machine T will perform. So if you like, it's a programmed computer. In fact, it's an interpretive code. It isn't compiled, it's simply interpreted step by step as the machine goes along. In order to define this machine, it has an enormous number of states as actually works. To define it more conveniently, he introduced abbreviated tables, which were in effect functions or macros, to be more exact, which would have to be expanded when you actually built the machine. It was not a concept of a higher level language, quite it was a concept of macros. And he wrote all this out. Now, one of the results of that is the simple answer that the number of numbers that you can compute with this machine must be enumerable. They must be in one-to-one correspondence with the natural numbers. Because, in fact, the number is entirely defined by what appears on the tape, and that is just a number. So that really almost disposes of the problem, because there must be plenty of numbers that aren't, just the number E. That doesn't actually dispose of the problem, because although E is not, although the irrational numbers, the real numbers, are not enumerable, we still don't know that all those, we can say that not all those are computable. It's quite true. But then we haven't got means of defining all the rational numbers, all the real numbers either. The ones that are in the books in mathematics are still possibly only a finite set. That doesn't answer the question, but he did produce a proof which showed that there were numbers which are uncomputable. To give you an idea of this, consider the number, which is a real number, on the tape, in which 0 and 1 represents a decision as to whether the machine defined by, let's take all the configurations tables and stretch them out along the tape, and each square on the tape for the output corresponds to one configuration table. Either it will reach an answer, or it will go around in circles and never stop. And according to which of those things happens, you put 0 or 1 on the tape. And that defines a real number. I've just defined it. It can't be computed. But it's not. That's the sort of basis of the proof. Now, this made a big dent in the enshrinement problem, but it also produced a definition of a computer, if you like, and a definition of what it means to have a process which can actually be computed. And of course, all this was, I guess, in Turing's mind when he joined the what was then government-coded cyber school at the beginning of the war to work in the field of cryptography, and the details of that work, of course, are still classified. We know a lot about the Colossus machine, which was a digital computer, not exactly programmed in the way today's are, but programmable by a plug, effectively, and capable of doing quite a lot. During that work at GCHQ, Turing was involved a lot with electronics, and later on, when he worked on speech scrambling, he was even more closely involved with electronics. So he had some background there. He was, by the way, a supremely unpractical person, a sort of fingers and thumbs person. It's true. That doesn't mean to say that he wasn't capable of thinking carefully about engineering design and doing it properly. But when he actually had to build things himself, they tended to be a little bit ramshackle. The work at what is now GCHQ involved the post office building Colossus and some of its predecessors, and the team that did that under Tommy Flowers included people Coombs, Doc Coombs, Chandler, and Broadbent. They were the main designers. All those except Broadbent, and one of Broadbent, Tommy Flowers after the war was required by the post office for work on electronic telephone exchanges, and Coombs and Chandler worked with us in the early days of the ex-partner. Broadbent I have met since, but was not involved. So the work at NPL did inherit, the work for NPL at the post office did inherit the people who had worked on the machine at Government Code and Cyber School. Now that's just enough about Turing for a moment. Let's turn to the origin of the mathematics division of NPL, for which the machine was built. During World War II, in a number of places in the country, there were big computational projects. Mainly because you can't do complex engineering design really without computers, as we now know, but all the computers we had were two-legged computers with the aid of marchants and glass-feeder calculators. So there were quite big teams in places churning out numerical computations. Probably the biggest one was the Admiralty Computing Service at Bath. There was also one working on armaments at Fort Halstead. I was involved with one working for the Tube Alloys project, which was the nuclear weapons project. We had about a dozen people in one particular team just doing a single computation solidly to try and, this was I think the critical size problem. I had my own personal computer, a young man who was at my beck and call to do numerical calculations. I used to do mathematics and a bit of numerical work to sort of get him started. And each morning we could pore over where he got to, and very often make a transformation to the problem halfway through the integration in order to overcome singularity or something like that. So very much hands-on type of numerical computation. Great fun. But being carried on quite a large scale during World War II, so that the need to be able to mechanize this was clear to everybody. Also, the need to be able to understand the numerical analysis was clear. In fact, we almost certainly understood it far better than people do now, because, of course, we were so close to it that we could see everything happening. Nowadays, I suspect that very often false results get churned out because you take too much for granted what a particular piece of software is supposed to do. At least we could see everything happening as it happened and be warned if things were going slightly wrong. So that was the origin, and towards the end of the war, a number of meetings took place. They're described quite well. Where did I get the description from? Anyway, there's a number of meetings took place to set up with the idea of setting up after the war a centre for this kind of work, and it got called the National Computing Centre. My note says National Computing Centre. This National Computing Centre was discussed at some length, and eventually it was decided to put it at NPL, and that became the mathematics division, whose primary task, as I understand it, was to understand and develop numerical methods, and then, hopefully with computers, that was only a far distant pie in the sky at the time, to carry these out. So initial work at NPL was done using punch card machines to some extent, using national cash register counting machines where you had to bang on these massive keys like a medieval bell ringer in order to make the machine work. But one of the things that happened to people when they first joined NPL was that they had to spend an hour a day, wherever they were, banging the national cash machine, which is part of the inauguration. That mathematics division was actually formed in 1945, and unlike some of the other things I'm going to describe, it was really given the resources that were planned right from the start. There wasn't too much any pinching about the formation of the mathematics division. J.R. Womersley became superintendent. I think a much misunderstood man. He was no mathematician. In fact, I think it was Wilkinson and Fox had a bet that neither of them would ever come out of his office having seen Womersley write an equation. And I think whoever asserted this won. So he was no mathematician, but he was an extraordinarily good manager, adept at fighting for his cause. In fact, mathematics division got a reputation for winning battles with administration by the method which works in the civil service, which is to use the rules to win your case. They were quite adept at doing that. That was started, that tradition, by John Womersley. So Womersley started to recruit people, and one of the first people he took on was Alan Turing, who joined in October. The division was formed in April 45. Turing joined in October. The reason for that is not at all clear. Now, it's also, and I hope I'm not saying anything I shouldn't here, fairly clear to me that GCHQ was quite interested in this computer project at NPL for various reasons. When the decision to build was made, one of the people from GCHQ, Commander Edward Travis, sent in a letter of support to the committee making the decision. Turing came from there. The people who actually built the early part of the machine at post office came from there. I'm pretty sure they had an interest, which they were fostering by making the project work and then presumably picking up some of the results later. So Turing came along in October, and what I'm not sure is how much, why Womersley knew about Turing and what was behind this. It's a chap called A.W. Phillips, who was an actuary, had advocated the binary code way back in the early 30s, or 20s even, and had talked to Turing and to Womersley, talked to Womersley about this. And there is a story that Womersley began to think about a thing he called the ACE during the war, 43 or so, and Phillips, I think, promulgated the story. I met Phillips for lunch in the Middle Temple one day, but the lunch was good, but I didn't get much out of him. He's a very nice chap. You know, so really this is a mystery. Now, Brian Randall tried to examine, in trying to examine Turing's influence on the origin of computers, wrote a paper in Machine Intelligence 7 in 1972, in which he went into some of these questions of origination very closely, and he couldn't really tie down this early meeting and how Womersley and Turing came together. But anyway, they came together, and Turing was immediately recruited to the NPL as a temporary SSO, my note says SOIC, at £800 per annum in October 95. Womersley, by the way, had coined the term ACE, meaning Automatic Computing Engine, in deference to Babbage, who used the term engine. Now, Turing began work immediately, and by December, in a remarkably short time, he had produced a magnificent report on the ACE, on the design of ACE. We have republished this at NPL. This is a copy. It's quite extraordinary. For example, I'm just looking at it on the train coming up. I described it, at the end, I see a superb description of the Williams tube, with all the practical and engineering problems described, ending up by saying, none of this involves any fundamental difficulty, but no doubt it will take time to develop. Surprisingly, this report never discusses which type of memory to use, but it does say, at one point, he describes problems of mercury delay lines in some detail, and says at the end, this is the system we will probably use. But he doesn't actually say why he decided that and not Williams tubes. Williams tubes, in his table of the characteristics of stores, comes up top in every respect. And by the way, he's talking about the Williams tube, not the iconoscope, which you probably know von Neumann talked a lot about, using iconoscopes, storage tubes, and I think RCA did a lot of work on that. The Williams tube was the first winner, and Turing was somehow aware of this. Maybe he talked to Williams, I'm not sure. Okay, the report is magnificent, contains all kinds of details, including the physics of delay lines, electrical delay lines, a lot on valves. And what he writes on valves is a little bit out in that he seems to miss quite where the source of the delay in valve circuitry will arise slightly. But it's sound, and it shows, there's a magnificent quote, now I hope I can find it, about the calculation of valve circuits. It's so good. Design of valve elements, and I must read it out. Certainly strike a chord. Oh yeah, yeah. In this chapter I shall discuss the limitations inherent in the problem, that's of designing valve circuits, and show that very simply circuit diagrams as a way of illustration. These circuits haven't been tried out. I have too much experience in electronic circuits to believe they will work just as they stand. Brackets. This does not represent a superstitious belief in the cussedness of circuits and the inapplicability of mathematics there too. Rather, it means that normally the amount of mathematical argument required to get a reliable prophecy of the behavior of a circuit is out of proportion to the small trouble required to try it out, or at any rate if one is in an electrical laboratory. In practice, one compromises with a rough mathematical argument, then follows up with experiment. The apparent cussedness of electronic circuits is due to the fact that it's necessary to make a lot of simplifying assumptions in these arguments, and that one is very liable to make the wrong ones by force analogy with other circuits one has dealt with on a previous occasion. The cussedness lies more in the minds dealing with the problem than the electronic circuits themselves. And it's typical of the report. Very good report, worth reading. Now, this was the most rapid part of the whole development of the Ace pilot model for 2.5 years. After that, it went along and slow. Okay. Now, Womersley, in his very inimitable way, sold the project to the executive committee because it wasn't committed. The mathematics division was committed, but the project hadn't been committed. Money hadn't been committed to it yet. And the decision was delayed twice, asking for more information and so on. But by May, which was not a bad, 5 months, not much less time than it took Turing to write his report, it had actually been agreed, and Womersley proposed to have a pilot model stage, which Turing, I think, was quite in favour of. At this point, Charles Darwin, who was the grandson, you probably know, of the great Darwin, I have an idea of Darwin. Is Darwin something? I see yes, George Darwin. Be careful what I say about Charles. Charles Darwin was the director of the NPL, and in those days NPL was a highly feudal type of organisation. When we were in the mathematics division, and Darwin was alleged to be was heard to be coming towards us, everything was carefully cleaned up. Darwin was always followed by a group of other people, sort of bowing to him on the way. It was really quite a procession. But Darwin placed a 3-year contract with the post office at Dollis Hill, and my understanding is that this was a contract to build Ace. Now, David Yates says that he had heard that it was a contract just to build delay lines. However, nothing else was going on towards the building of Ace, and maybe Darwin thought he would take it in 2 stages, building the delay lines first and then the rest later. But anyway, a contract was placed with the post office in June 46 to construct Ace, and the Dollis Hill offered to give it high priority. And indeed they put Coombs and Chandler onto this project. At the same time, Jim Wilkinson, the first of the employees other than Turing to be in this project, joined the project. And I've got here a little time diagram, because I shall mention a lot of dates. It probably gives you a better picture. Here is mathematics division being formed, Turing's report and Turing's stay at NPL, the decision time to build. Wilkinson was brought in meanwhile, and Mike Woodger, who unfortunately can't be here today, came later but was ill for a while, so he came almost at the same time. He was ill for a while, so he really joined there. The next recruitment to that group was myself and Joe Galway there, so I'm ill-equipped really to explain what's happening here, you must realise, because I didn't come in until then. Now there's the post office contract. And Coombs and Chandler were put onto it. Found that Turing had been working to improve it. To address machine, you'll see that because it's what the pilot model. At that time, it had become an address machine in which an instruction tipped in, take something from address A, something from address B, do some function on them and put them in address C. That's the typical shape of the function. So it had already become a 3-address machine. But the emphasis was still on having simple hardware and rather clever and complex programming to get high speed, and not being too worried about the complexity of the programming, being more concerned about getting the hardware as simple as possible. Now that's not the philosophy, for example, of Cambridge, but it was definitely the philosophy at NPL. Okay. Now at that point something curious happened. History is a little bit difficult to get at. Both Darwin and Womersley were involved in writing to Manchester and Cambridge, where other projects had started, and asking them if they would design and develop Ace. But this is very difficult to understand. It obviously fell on deaf ears. They were too busy doing their own thing. As far as I can make out, Wilkes, unfortunately, I was hoping he could illuminate this. It's not here. Maurice Wilkes said, yes, we'll do it, and the design will be such and such, and it looked like it's and Turing looked at that, and his letter was polite, but you could see that he was pretty furious. He didn't want it that way, and that failed naturally. I mean, this was a pretty dead loss to try and do this, wasting a bit of time, but it happened. The correspondence has been turned up by Mike Woodger. Wilkes, I don't think, can even remember the correspondence, which shows how it didn't really have any effect anyway. Another very interesting thing, which has had later repercussions, was Harry Husky, a very colourful individual. I still keep in touch with him. A very nice chap, very personable individual who had worked on ENIAC. So he was clearly a great man to have with us in this project. And he'd left Moore School and was going to join National Bureau of Standards. But he decided he would have a sabbatical year in England, at NPL, and there is a sabbatical year, exactly January to December. And so, of course, I met him as soon as I got there. He seemed to be the most lively person in the whole group, I would say. You know, he really a go-getter, sort of will-do, can-do type of individual. He had, when he first joined, he was given the task by Turing of going round to the other projects and the post office and making a report. His report exists, and he has written up what his part in the story in two places in the Annals of the History of Computing, Volume 13, Harry D. Husky, the early days, and a paper that I don't know its final publication, but it's called From ACE to the G15. I'll talk about that later. That paper was written, I've got a draft copy here, 82. Now Husky wanted to build a pilot model himself, and after a lot of pushing, he said, permission to do so. Now I'm not sure that he did. I think that Womersley connived with him in getting something started. I don't believe it was, strictly speaking, an official project when it started. Because of the pushing and getting it done. So when I joined, I first found that the version had reached 7C. By the way, it stopped there because Turing had left at that point. Whether we went through lots of versions, but perhaps we just didn't number them. And it was a very detailed and very careful design for the full-scale ACE. NPL was designing the full-scale ACE still. Husky wanted to build a pilot model and got permission. I joined him fairly soon because I was very frustrated with working in a maths team. What we were doing was writing again and again programs for a non-existing machine for which we could never test. So that was frustrating to start with. So I joined Husky's team and started to work on the test assembly. Meanwhile, about the same time as I joined, Newman, Ted Newman, who's down here, and David Clayton, down there. Ted, put your hand up, please. Put your hand up, Ted. And David Clayton joined from EMI, and they formed our electronics expertise, of which we were badly in need, bringing with them principles of electronic design from Bloomline, as you know, a genius in that field, and with the aid of their experience in television and radar, they adapted this to computing circuits and devised a circuit technique which will be described later, and I'm sure you will see that it's an admirable technique. In fact, it has, even today, semiconductor analogs of this are being used for the fastest of the logic. Common cathode logic, nowadays common emitter logic. Well, very soon in the team, which we actually moved over bodily into the same building, Bushy House, with the group that Newman and Clayton were with, very soon I got a visit from Ted, who told me in very forthright terms that we were wasting our time using the wrong kind of logic and that we should do it a different way. And I agree with him. I can see that what he was proposing was far better. Meanwhile, out of loyalty to Husky, we went on until it wasn't very long before Husky was due to leave. I've rather skipped over something here, which was about the same time that all this was happening. An electronics section was formed, and the post office contract was closed, all in a very short period. This indicates, I think, an understanding now by Darwin that having a separate unit some miles away doing this work for us, it just wasn't going to work too well. It was just not possible to separate the groups. We used to beetle over to Dollis Hill and talk about the logic design to them and so on from time to time. But our contract was closed down and an electronics section was formed within the radio division of NPL. H.A. Thomas from the radio division was put in charge of that. And that group was building really the infrastructure for the computer, getting the power supply arrangements, working out methods of generating logic circuits and so on, but not actually building equipment that would be the final pilot model, except, of course, for the delay lines, which they began to work on straight away. And I'm not quite sure how much we got from the post office. Ted will probably explain that, or David. But effectively, the work, our contact with the post office was dropped, but not entirely. The post office continued to work on the ACE design, and we went over from time to time to help them with this. I remember producing a design of multiplier, not the best multiplier, I think a much better one was produced later. But it was a design of multiplier that worked wonderfully well. Later on, I was amazed to see that multiplier in the flesh at Malvern. because this machine became Mosaic, which went to Malvern and worked for the Ministry of Supply there. So the post office did go on, and the ACE design, perhaps modified in many ways, I don't know, did eventually get built in a form in Mosaic. So others will know better what actually the final shape of that was. Now, still though, things were not, I think, organised in the best possible way. So I would say that our problems in those early days were ones rather of organisation. We had plenty of good people, but the organisation was still deficient in that we had one team doing rather in vacuo work on the logical design, another team doing electronics. And then things finally came together about mid-48 when we moved over from the mathematics division enclave in the south of the laboratory site and joined the rest in Bushing House. I remember Jim Wilkinson actually cycled over with an oscilloscope balanced on the crossbars on the handlebar of his bike. So we joined, and immediately we set to work. In fact, I organised an assembly line of mathematicians putting in and soldering, well, first I had to teach them to solder, putting in components to produce a small model of the bit that I thought was going to create a lot of trouble, which was the input statusizer, output dynamicizer bit of the machine. So in a sense, we sort of started off doing something, probably wrongly, but at least we were actually doing something. And that combined team worked extremely well and produced the machine eventually by the end, I think it was November 50, the machine was in a state where it could be demonstrated to the press and somewhat haltingly do jobs. Sometime in 51 it became a really useful machine, and you'll hear a lot about that later. But I do want to say something before I finish about some of the outcome of Husky's contribution, because Husky left NPL and went back to Washington. He didn't stay there very long because he'd been to a conference in the Institute of Numerical Analysis, which at UCLA, which I think was part of, or closely associated with him, part of NPL. And he really wanted to live out there. So he worked out the idea of building a computer at INA, at UCLA in Los Angeles. And he got this approved eventually. And so he went out there and built what became known as SWAC, Standards Western Automatic Computer. Nothing like part model. But sometime later, Bendix Corporation approached him and said, look, we'd like to make a small and economic computer that could sell in large numbers. And he thought, pilot model. He designed this computer based entirely on the pilot model design, using magnetic drums. And he made them into recirculating stores by having them read the information at one point and then rewrite it at another point. So in that way, he could wrap a number of drums around a number of delay lines around one track drum and make short delay lines if you wanted to. So he had a real analog, exact analog, a bit slower, of course, but maybe 8 or 9 times slower, of the ACE working with magnetic drums. This was called a G15 computer, and 400 of them were built. So in terms of the outcome in hardware, it was much the most successful of the ACE analogs. The last one had a gold-plated control panel, and in as a sort of memento to Husky for doing this good work, Bendix gave him one of these machines, which he installed in his garage. I went to see him once in Berkeley, where he then was, and he opened the garage door, and a mass of heat came up. It was warm outside, it was even warm inside. And this was a moderate-sized machine, and it worked very well. Now, I believe Husky had the first home computer. And that machine is now in the Smithsonian Museum. Not, I'm afraid, working. They don't have a computer conservation society. But anyway, it's there. And I was amazed to see it, and also amazed to see that the picture they called Husky was somebody else. They agreed it was, but they said, well, nobody knows. Anyway, that's... Now, there was another outcome, which I was reminded about by R.T. Clayton, actually, David Clayton's brother, which was that he went away from NPL, having worked at NPL for the English Electric Company, and went to EMI and built the EMI business computer, automatic computer for them. And this was also based on it was a magnetic drum machine. It was very much like the G15. The concept was the same. Unfortunately, only one of those was built, but it was put into use by the British Motor Corporation. It was built for them, but it wasn't a serial machine, and it wasn't serially produced. It was just one-off. So that, in fact, it had progeny of another kind. Okay, now, I've reached this point, and then from that point, I guess other people will take over from me. You can see that this story is not an altogether happy one, and the problems were mainly organisational ones. But when they were overcome, things went quite swimmingly. Eventually, now let me just show you some pictures, if I can. Give me our first slide. That is the pilot model in 1950 at the time of its press release. Here are the short delay lines. The long delay lines are in that box there, going out into a sort of cubby hole out there. This is the control panel contraption that I made. These are the punch card machines in which I arranged the interconnection. By the way, I took over the job of connecting punch card machines to electronics, which is not easy. From the name.
Stanley Gill.
Sorry?
Stanley Gill.
Stanley Gill, yes. From Stanley Gill, who was at first at NPL before he went to Cambridge. We lost a lot of people out in Cambridge. Anyway, these are the chassis. Now, the actual constructional method was Husky's method turned on its side. And why Husky did it this way was that that's the way ENIAC did it. ENIAC had horizontal chassis. The same constructional method was used, they were turned vertically, which actually improved cooling. It also meant that when they caught fire, they went up like a bomb. So but anyway, there it is. That shows Ted Newman. Apart from myself, the only other person who's here. Colbrook, who I should have mentioned because he was the person who took over from Thomas. Thomas left in a great hurry. He was more interested, and I should have mentioned this, when the electronics section was formed, at least part of its job, half of it, was to spread electronics into industry. A lot of things to do, didn't help the project a lot. Thomas got so interested in that he went public in the newspapers one day, and the following day he left NPL, because he didn't do that kind of thing. And Wilkinson, who was the mathematical genius of the numeric analysis side, became a professor eventually at Stanford, and myself, a young college then. That's right. And that shows George. Is this you, George? Oh, that's George Davis. About 1952, we moved the thing bodily from where it was built in the Bushy house to a room that had been vacated by, I think, by a wind tunnel or something like that, and reconstructed in different form with different kinds of delay lines and so on. And it worked within. Can we get the which one?
Donald, can I point out, on the right-hand side are some of the folded.
Yes. Could you adjust the focus, or perhaps it's the best one? Sorry, I was looking at George, who's not in focus. Oh, yes. Okay, down here you can see some folded delay lines, of which there's an example down there. I don't know whether Fred Osborne will talk about those, but I designed that particular construction as being more convenient to build and to keep the temperature controlled, in which the sound is reflected at the end of the delay line, and it's also fully adjustable, which helps a bit. Well, that's just all I want to show back, I think. By that time we had a multiplier. That's what made me worry about whether it was George, because that's not what
That's Harry.
Harry, yes, Harry. Yeah. That's a card copier. Sorry, that's a new high-speed reader which I attached to the machine, and that's a nice control panel which I have made somewhere in Europe by a company that specialised in that sort of thing. And that's a close-up on. It goes back to the early ones, because those are the earliest form of short delay lines. That's probably the last one, isn't it? No, I've gone on to ACE, just to give you a picture of it, although it's not part of that subject. This shows people building ACE, and that shows how much bigger it is. It was a magnificent piece of engineering design. You can see that when you look at it from a distance. Very extraordinary panel. Someone said it looked like Stonehenge. But it was the full-scale ACE, built rather late in the day, when core stores existed, and the whole raison d'etre of Turing's schemes, which we'll hear about from Michael Wright, was now rather pointless. But it did good work for a long period until we eventually I changed it for a more modern machine. So that concludes my story, and I think I'll hand over now to Michael Wright.
Thank you very much.
I think there will be a couple of minutes interlude while we gather our things together.
I thought a little while now.
I also have a bit of a problem because I have to use one set of glasses for reading and another set of glasses for looking at things in a distance. So please bear with me on that. I seem to have got papers in a confused mess. So, I've lost one slide. Right, I think I can actually begin now. Well, first of all, my name is Michael Wright, and I am very grateful to have the opportunity, privileged to have the opportunity of talking here today. A privilege which I think I owe quite a lot to Dr. H.A. Thomas that Don Davis has talked about, because one day in the middle of 1947, he invited me to come and join the team which he was then setting up to build this machine. To start, he had a fairly raw bunch of people that he recruited from within NPL with very little experience of pulse circuits and so on, and certainly of computers. We didn't know anything about the computers. And so Thomas started by giving a series of lectures on the ideas for a computing machine, which he picked up from the discussions with the mathematics group. And he, first of all, of course, put forward the idea that you could actually make a computing machine which would obey an instruction and which would also select the next instruction so that you could then have a machine which would obey a sequence of instructions. He also described how you could select an alternative next instruction if some sort of condition was established, so that you can then go and not only perform strings of instructions, but loops of instructions, and then complicate programs. At this time, it was all incredibly new, fascinating ideas, and for me, Thomas's lectures opened a new and very exciting door. So I'm very grateful to him for having sort of opened that door for me. Thomas's lectures started on with the idea I think with the idea of an ideal instruction being in the form which Donald Davis mentioned a little while ago of a three-address code where you have a function and an A and a B term which sent result to C, and also included a next instruction. We called that a 3+1 address code machine. The Pilot Ace, though, was a bit simpler version than that. We called that a 2+1 code machine because it only called for 2 addresses for operating things plus 1 address for the next instruction. Now, I've got to actually hurry on fairly quickly through my description because I've got quite a lot to say. The next thing I need to say is that we had hardware constraints. In 1947, we had to use electronic valves for switching pulses, and they were power-consuming, expensive, and not very reliable. And this was even if you've got no reasonable circuit design. So we decided, the team as a whole decided, that it would have to use as few of these machines as possible. In other words, we had to make as small a machine as possible. It had also been decided that we would use mercury delay lines for the memory, and I can't add any light to the points which Donald raised about that precisely why. But I think, it seemed to me it was because they offered what we might term the best memory technology at that time. Memory technology was not then talked about. Well, having chosen mercury delay lines for the memory, they have a major impact on the design. I assume that everybody knows that mercury delay lines work by injecting a serial string of pulses into a transducer, which then transforms the pulses into sonic waves, which pass down a tube of mercury and are received at the far end by another transducer, which amplifies them, retimes them, and then re-injects them into the tube. But because of this sort of nature of the thing, they impose two major constraints. One, that you have to have a serial machine, as opposed to the Williams tube, where you can have a parallel machine. And also, you have to have synchronization of all the memory. But at the time, it seemed to be feasible to make delay lines which were about 5 foot long, and this provided a delay down tube of a millisecond. And if you operated the thing at about a megacycle, you could store about 1,000 pulses. So that was sort of one bit of starting point information. The maths people, I think, decided that at that time, I'm not quite sure when they decided what size basic number they would need to do calculations, but when I came into the scene, it had been decided that the basic number length would be 32 bits, and also that it might be possible to, or it was possible to hold an instruction for the machine in the same length. Now that was a very important decision, but because of that, it was decided that the long delay lines would store 1,024 bits, which is 32 times 32, and that the machine would be able to perform useful instructions if it was able to have 8 of these long delay lines, storing a total of 256 numbers, 32-bit numbers or instructions. Now, when one compares a store of 256 numbers with today's machines, one wonders how on earth it can ever perform useful instructions, useful computations. It seems quite incredible. Well, I now want to show you something about what the long delay line, the implications of delay lines on the design of the machine. And I've got a little slide here which I will pop in there. Turn a couple of switches on. I don't know if we've got a pointer. Very good. Up here I've drawn a delay line. This is the long delay line. The pulses come in at this end, they go around there, they're recirculated round there. But they're inhibited from recirculating if there's something coming in on this line here. But we'll come back to that in a minute. Basically, the numbers come out of the delay line.
Laser point. Laser
Oh,
point.
this is all right.
Get the back technology for this afternoon.
The numbers come out of here on what is we call the source side, and there was a switch here, a source switch, which said if this is open, a 2-gate, you get the number coming out from this long delay line down into the highway. Remember, this is a source. The numbers come down through the highway, and they come down in my simplistic little diagram into a control box, which has got a time impulse stuck on, so that you take out just one number from the middle of that delay number, wherever it is, and it's actually controlled by that impulse. The then selected comes down here and goes along this the highway this side to what we call the destination switches on this side. And here there's some set of switches, just like ones on this side, which select which of these delay lines is to be take the new number. I've drawn here a short delay line because you will realise that if you have a long delay line with a number in a position down here, you could only transfer it to another long delay line in the same position. So you had to have a short delay line so that you could manipulate things within the delay line. And of course you needed a short delay line for lots of other purposes too. But basically what I wanted to show from here is that the use of delay lines virtually impose this kind of structure of a sources down one side, a switching mechanism there, a control box at the bottom with some timing in it, and the highway with destinations on that side. Well, now I'm going to, I hope not to horrify you too much, by showing you a highly complicated diagram. And I hope you can all at least get some idea that everybody advised me that this is far too complicated a diagram to put up on a slide, but I've done it because it's a historical diagram. This actually is a photocopy of one of the drawings. The design, I think it was not the original, it's been redrawn, but it was redrawn actually by David Clayton, and the design of it was attributed to Harry Husky, although of course a number of people contributed to the design, particularly Wilkinson. And point out a batch of long delay lines. Here are some sources on this side and destinations on this, and the highway actually goes up round there. There are altogether 8 long delay lines drawn here, and together there are, point out to you, is that first of all, this is the diagram of the whole machine, and up here is the bit of control which deals with the timing of the opening of the switches on the highway, and which also deals with the timing to get out the next instruction. There's a trigger here which is TT, which I'll talk about later, which is the thing which does that major bit of timing. Down here, there are what we call the destination tree, which sets which of those switches is to be put on. Above that, there is a source tree similar, the pulse train, zero pulse train, there's a cannon. These triggers are sworn, that rather than provide actually static and sworn. Now, the other thing I'll take the opportunity of doing is to point out that chucked amongst all this lot, there are some arithmetic functions. Down here there are the long delay lines. Somewhere in here there are some short delay lines. And in the middle there, and associated with these short delay lines, there are some arithmetic functions. Now, the pilot ace used a very curious and I think clever arrangement to encode functions to be performed with the address part of the instruction. For example, if you sent source 1 of the long delay lines to a destination or to a short, which was a short delay line, you could send, for example, a word from a long delay line into one of the short delay lines called TS16. If you sent the number to a destination 17, it went into an adder first and was then added to the contents, the new number was added to the contents of TS16. The similar technique was used to provide a subtractor. And similar techniques were also used on the source side, so that you've got functional sources. For example, you could get the the output of one of the short delay lines delayed by 1 digit, which in effect multiplied it by 2 from one of the sources. Another of the sources provided logical operations between 2 of the short delay lines. I'll refer to those in a little bit more detail in describing the order code in a couple of minutes. The other thing which this curious encoding arrangement provided was for using a destination, one of the destinations or some of the destinations as triggers. For example, you could send a source, a number from, say, one of the long delay lines to a destination 25, and if it was a 0, it set a trigger. That's all was on the trigger side, but the trigger actually then was part of the control, and I'll come back to that in a minute. It was a trigger called D for discrim, which in effect had the effect of delaying the next instruction to be selected by one place. In other words, you selected the next instruction but one. Well, I'll now run through those in a bit more detail, showing the this is the code for DEUCE. I was inveigled to use the code for DEUCE rather than presenting to you the code for the ACE, the pilot ACE, because later in today's talks, other people will be using this, and I didn't want to confuse you over much. Might go pass home. Up here, there is down the side the set of numbers from 0 to 31. Here are the list of sources. Here are the list of destinations. Now, source 1 to 12 were long delay lines. Sources 13 to 21 were a collection of shorter delay lines. Actually, on the pilot ACE, there were only 2 or 3 short delay lines, and I think there was a double length, but no quadruple lengths. Now here we start the functional address stuff. Source 22 gives the contents of a double length delay line 21 delayed by 1, in other words, multiplied by 1. The next one gives it another delay line advanced by 1 microsecond, in other words, divided by 1. 2, I'm sorry. Source 25 gives TS14 ANDed with the contents of TS15. 26 gives the contents of TS14, not equivalent with the contents of. These things just give some rather standard pulses which are used for P1, P17, P32. I haven't made source 0, and that is given to the input for a very specific reason, which I'll come to later. On the other side, we have some destinations. Now again, destination 0 was the control box, what's called a short delay line in the control box called TS count, and that had source 0, again for a very specific reason. Down here, the standard delay line numberings for the destinations. Then we have here a thing called destination triggers, which is, as I described a little while ago, but this one was the destination triggers on DEUCE was a little bit more complicated than the pilot ACE. On that, you could send source 0 to destination triggers, and you stimulated the multiplier. If you sent the source 1 to it, you stimulated the divider, and so on. There were a number of functions which achieved that way. Here, source 20, destination 26, at the previous contents of a short delay line number 13, subtract 1. Here, 28, are these discriminator errors. They set a discrimination trigger, which, if the trigger is set, it delays the instruction by 1, so that you have you next perform the next but 1 instruction instead of the next one that you expect. Destination 29 was the staticizer. This is where you sent your output if you wanted to have it punched. And these two are the drum transfers, which I won't go into. up here, if I can reach, I just about can. I don't know whether everybody can see this, but the P1 digit, this is the instruction format, the P1 digit wasn't used. The next 3 digits were used to select the next instruction source, the next 5 the actual source for the operation, the next 5 for the destination. Now, when you wanted to actually to carry out a transfer, you set up the source that you wanted and the destination that you wanted, and then you had to specify the timing. Now, the wait number basically specifies the timing. There are 5 digits there, so that you can pick out any one of the 32 slots in a long delay line. I'll jump a bit to say that if you, in order to specify the next instruction, you set up the source of your next instruction, and notice that you can only pick instructions from 8 delay lines, numbers 1 to 8, and you have, of course, to set up a time at which you want to extract that instruction, and that's done basically by means of a timing number here, and there are 5 digits there to select any one of 32 slots in a long delay line where the next instruction resides. There are a couple of other things that I'd better mention. Firstly, you can do a short transfer by setting a 1 in one of these digits, or actually DEUCE provided a slightly more complicated system, but in the pilot case there was 1 digit which was called the serial digit, and set that, it simply transferred the number which was specified by the wait number. If you didn't set it, you had a block transfer, a long transfer, in which, so that you actually did a transfer which was the number specified by the timing number T minus the wait number plus 1. So it was actually quite a powerful instruction set there. The only other digit that I haven't mentioned is the P32 one, which is called the go digit, and some of us used to call it the stop digit. And basically, if the stop digit, if there wasn't a P32 in the instruction, the machine stopped in its tracks. Well, at least it counted its cycles, but it stopped obeying instructions, and that was a very useful instruction from a number of points of view. Now, let me try and synchronize what I've said with what I've got down here. Ah, yes. I've now got another slide for you, which is another historic document. As I say, would it be better if that was higher? This is a historic document in that it was drawn by Donald Davis and designed by Ted Newman, and it's the Mark II version of the control of the Pilot Ace. Basically, it worked, and you know, it's a relatively simple thing, really, although it looks daunting here. Basically, there's a trigger here called TCI, and if that is on, it switches this gate and take the next and pass it into this thing called TS count, which is the storage in the control box. It immediately when it comes out of this, the part of the code which represent destination selection. They go straight out there. This bit is more the timing array. And basically up here there is an adder which adds in ones to the bottom end of the weight and timing numbers. And when there is a carryover, when you've filled in all the gaps, so to speak, that switches on trigger which ultimately switches on this trigger TT, which starts the transfer process. Now, it can only actually do that if go digit, you remember, is the carry pulse can't switch on that trigger R and circuit, and it can do when perhaps some of a trigger so that it can be actually. If the machine is going to do a short transfer, this trigger P is, which has been switched on by R, that trigger P is then switched off, and that actually eventually switches trigger TT. At the same time, the count is proceeding in the timing position. We were dealing with the weight number there. We're doing a similar sort of thing in the timing side, and we look here for the timing. And when that comes on, it sets trigger Q, which is on this trigger TC. There is one other thing just worth that trigger here called D, which is the just been set. It stops this trigger turned until one cycle later, the previous one. The next thing I want to talk about is optimum programming, which is another curious feature of the NPL machine, the pilot base. You recall that the long delay lines have slots for 32 numbers, words, or instructions. Now, in this arrangement, each instruction took 1 word time to set up, and the instruction could take a number of word times to actually be obeyed. The shortest being, of course, another word time. Now, if you put instructions in order of sequence in positions 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 down the delay line, immediately after you'd obeyed the first instruction, you would have just missed the opportunity of getting the next instruction. And so you'd have to wait a whole minor cycle, whole major cycle, 1 millisecond, for the number to reappear at the end of the delay line. So it was decided that it would be sensible to place the instructions in strategic positions in the delay line so that as soon as you finished the instruction, the current instruction, the next instruction would be emerging out of the delay line, and you could then obey it with no loss of time. Well, this was not perhaps as difficult as it might sound, but it was a little bit tedious, and it was a challenge, and it was very worthwhile when you were considering the inner loops of programs which were performed time and time again. And you could often get speeds out of the machine which were perhaps 10 instructions per millisecond instead of 1 if you hadn't used optimum programming. So it was a very, very worthwhile technique. I now want to switch, and I hope that's explained that enough. So I'm now going to move on very quickly to the input and output. Now, as Donald says, the pilot base used Holworth cards for input and output, and these cards had spaces for 12 rows and 80 columns. But the pilot base actually only used 32 of the columns. Now, the cards were read in at 200 cards a minute and punched out at 100 a minute, giving 40 words a second and 20 a second, respectively. Now, this rate, of course, is much slower than anything on the pilot ACE, and you had to achieve synchronization by some means. Now, with the delay lines, that is. Now, this was done by a kind of interrupt mechanism using the input dynamicizer and the output staticizers, which set a pattern in a sort of stationary form instead of a serial form. The synchronization itself was achieved by using this go digit thing. What you did was to, when you called a read instruction from a delay line, you put a, well, you set the reader going, and then you read from source naught, if you were reading, and you put an instruction which said source naught to destination so and so, and you put no go digit in other words, a stop digit. And the machine then stuck in that position until it received an external stimulus from the Horowitz machine to say that a row was in a position ready to be read, and then the instruction was obeyed, and we went again. Now, of course, there was a lot of time, 25 milliseconds between the rows being read on the card, and that was an awful waste of time. And Pilot ACE was a very ingenious machine, and we couldn't afford to waste that time. So what we did was to put a lot of program into the machine in the middle of the reading cycle, and so that you perhaps used, say, 20 milliseconds at the time, and then you put your instruction naught to the delay line, the read instruction, with a stop digit or a no-go digit, and the machine then stopped at that point and waited for the row of the Horowitz machine to be in a position ready to be read, and then it went off again. And of course that saved an enormous amount of time in the reading and writing and punching, especially if you had a job which had a lot of input and output.
Wrap up, please.
Yes, I'm near the end. The Pilot ACE had a multiplier. It was a separate multiplier which actually acted as a parallel sub-machine. Multiplication was initiated by stimulating one of those triggers which I mentioned, and a double-length product was formed in two of the designated delay lines. The programmer actually had to decide when he could use the result from the multiplier. There was no interlock. He just had to wait, and on the pilot model, Pilot ACE, he had to wait 2 milliseconds for the multiplication to be finished. I just want to mention very briefly the startup procedures and the operating system. The operating system is very easy to wrap up very quickly because the Pilot ACE had no operating system. And startup was achieved very simply by clearing the store, and that gave an instruction which said naught, naught to naught, 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 which meant the stop digit was, or the go digit was 0. So the machine waited. The instruction source naught meant read the row on the card. Sending it to destination naught meant sending it straight to the control. The timing numbers naught and naught said do it immediately. And the naught at the end said wait until a Horowitz row is in a position ready to be read until you actually do the thing. And when it was in a position ready to be read, the instruction was obeyed. The actual routine for input and output, was a very simple one. It involved 4 instructions. The first one of the first ones of which actually filled a delay line that was going to be read into with a standard instruction to say read the next, put the next row in the current position and then go on to the next line. So with 4 instructions plus 32 words that had to be read into the delay line, that made 36 rows of numbers to be punched on cards, and that was done by a triptych of 3 cards, and that was a very standard and easy procedure. I'll just mention very briefly the test facilities. This important Go digit had very useful applications in testing programs. By setting it at 0 strategic points, you could let the machine run through a program and then hopefully stop at the chosen run. Of course, if you didn't stop at the chosen run and gone somewhere else, you had to backtrack and find out where it's gone wrong by putting a stopper in some of the earlier instructions. But basically, well, you could actually have no Go digits in any of your instructions, and you could have what we termed one shot, providing an external stimulus to the Go trigger, so that you could work through the program step by step. Of course, it's not possible with those machines to do anything like that. So just to summarize, and I've overrun my time a bit, the Pilot Ace was a very small machine. Its design was very clever and it offered enormous scope for ingenuity. There was a price paid for ingenuity in the time taken to write programs, but of course programs weren't all that big in those days, so it wasn't such a severe problem as it would be today. Also, programmers were relatively cheap compared with computers, which were then very expensive, and I suppose the reverse of all that is that is the total reverse of today's situation, when programmers are expensive and machines are cheap. And I guess that's one of the reasons why a lot of the ingenious tricks which went into the Ace Pilot model are not being perpetuated in today's computers.
Now, before I launch forth into the Ace Pilot model, I think under the circumstances it would be right, looking around the audience, to expect that some of them haven't experienced the joys of designing valve systems. I think young electronic engineers nowadays who I speak to about valves, and they say, valve, what is that? Now, the big problem with designing valve circuits in those days was that manufacturer specifications varied enormously for a particular valve. If you connected a valve up to its supplies, set it at a particular bias, a particular anode voltage, you found the current was specified with tolerances of like plus or minus 30%. And this was the basis of the problem of designing valve circuits. And Ted Newman and I arrived at NPL in 1947, as Donald said, having been at EMI for some years, and particularly we benefited from the philosophy of Blumlein, who had died in 1942, but his philosophy lived on amongst the engineers of EMI, and we brought that philosophy with us to NPL, and we designed circuits which to a large extent behaved independently of the initial tolerances on valve performance, and they remained working for quite a long time in spite of the fact that valves do deteriorate with time. Now, one such circuit was, I've got that up right, yes. have what is known as a long-tailed double triode. Let's see if I can make this device work. No. It appears to be silent. Oh no, there it is. Okay, I've got a spot. There are two cathodes here connected together. A resistance of 10k minus 100. That grid is biased at 0. That grid has an input which can be either plus 10 or minus 10. And up here we have an anode with a 2k resistor up to plus 200. And this valve would be a 6J6 type of, if any of you remember the types of those years, but probably an ECC 981, which was the later type number. Now, the point about this is that using a valve in this manner, you didn't care what the voltage on the cathode was. Because you've got roughly 100 volts across that 10k, you knew it was going to pass 10 milliamps. And if that grid was higher than that grid, then the current went up that side to that anode. On the other hand, if that was down at minus 10, the current would go up this side. And it was then 10 milliamps into 2.2k, which gave you 20 volts, like. And the bias might start off at, say, 5 volts typically, so that the cathode then would sit at plus 5, and as the valve died, the bias would reduce until it got down to about plus 1.5 on the cathode, when you knew you were going to run into grid current problems. Grid current could be in one of two directions. If it was positive grid current, then that would drag the grid down. On the other hand, if the valve went soft, you've got negative grid current, it tends to drag the grid up. But we found with circuits of this type, valve circuits would remain working for a considerable amount of time without changing their apparent output. This was the important thing about it. Now that was the simplest sort of circuit. We went on to devise, sorry, set it up the right way, more complicated arrangements. Here we have which we did indeed use on the AC pilot model. Now, at this point, having said a bit of philosophy, I would like to go back to Donald Davis's history of the AC pilot model. Ted Newman and I arrived at NPL late in 1947. We found ourselves in radio division of the NPL. We'd come from a place where the language spoken was electronic engineering, connected with television radar, which we had both worked on. We went to radio division where the language spoken was about propagation of transmitters and receivers. And there was another group of people at NPL in maths division whose language was integration and differentiation and all that, and statistics and all that sort of jazz. So it was rather like a Tower of Babel, we felt. But anyway, we rapidly got to learn each other's language, and I think we got on very well together under the circumstances. Now, Ted and I, our first job was to get the mercury delay line circulation units working. And as Donald showed on his charts and had been going on this at Dollis Hill, and we popped off to Dollis Hill for the first few weeks to gather together the information on what had been going on there. They produced a lump of equipment which we transported back to NPL and started to play with. Incidentally, we found it was oscillating madly at an extremely high frequency with Barkhausen oscillation because they hadn't got grid stoppers in. But we soon mended that situation. Now, here is a block diagram. It rotates in the opposite direction to Michael White's one, incidentally. Never mind. It rotates in this direction. Here is a mercury delay line. It has a transmitter to send it information, a receiver RN, because mercury delay lines have an attenuation of about 60 dB. That is about 1,000 to 1. So we will need a receiver to amplify what comes out of the mercury delay line, a detector to detect it. Here we have a clock pulse gate to retime the rotation of the information. A destination gate, this was shown on Michael White's slide. There the information is at the width of the clock pulses. Now, clock pulses were at a megacycle, and so pulses were of, the information was of a duration of 1 microsecond. The clock pulses were about 1/3 of a microsecond wide. So the information here is 1/3 of a microsecond wide, and we need a widener to turn it into information of 1 microsecond wide, a modulator to modulate the signal at 15 megahertz, that's the carrier frequency, and that then feeds the transmitter and go around again to the mercury receiver, if I can get it. So it continues to rotate around there until we interrupt it using that destination gate. Now here is an input from the control unit which inhibits the circulation and instead lets in information from the destination highway. HW stands for highway, which has already been produced. So to put new information in, you send it down along the highway, send a signal from the control unit to switch over, switch, so that puts new information in. There is a source highway up there with a gate to let out information onto the source highway. Also an instruction highway to let information from here out onto the instruction highway to go to the control unit. Now, I wish you to bear that in mind, but I will now pass on to some of the circuit design which actually implemented that. Here is the clock pulse gate. There is the now familiar double triode, which I've spoken of. Incidentally, those little resistors there are the grid stoppers, which I mentioned, which are for the purpose of stopping Barkhausen oscillation. In this particular case, down here, we have a clock pulse gate consisting of a pentode and a diode. Now, at that time, 1948, 49, 50, there did exist germanium diodes, and these were used quite extensively in the machine. This was our first attempt at making use of semiconductors. However, triodes didn't come until much later. So here we have an input of clock pulses, which are AC coupled and biased there into this pentode diode gate, and we get pulses 1/3 of a microsecond wide, or in this case about 10 milliamps up here. They either go to the left or to the right, depending upon this input from the detector. And so we get pulses, negative pulses on this anode of about 20 volts, which is a string of ones and noughts, as it were, AC coupled into this fellow, which happens to be a cathode follower, an output here, which goes on to the rest of the circuit. We used a cathode follower there because this output does in fact go to several places, and we had loading considerations to consider. That's the clock pulse gate, which form part of that block diagram, remember. The next picture is of a source gate. The source gate has information coming from the clock pulse gate coming in here. It is in fact AC coupled and DC restored by means of a diode. Goes in here, and this is a gate which provides current up here. Again, the current is defined by this resistor down to -300, goes up there, and depending on whether this grid is up or down, it either goes up to that anode or not. Now, this grid gets its voltage from this anode by means of what we call a DC coupling. Now, this is a pair of resistors up there and a pair of resistors here. The important point being that if the ratio between those two resistors is the same as the ratio between those two resistors, and if the time constant of that capacitor and that resistor is the same as the time constant of that capacitor and that resistor, then it becomes a well-behaved wide-band filter, the bandwidth being determined by the value of that anode resistor and the stray capacities of the system. And in the case of the destination gate, which I shall come to in a moment, the important thing is that this grid has to switch over between two consecutive clock pulses. So you'd like this to switch over in like half a microsecond. And using a network of this sort, we managed to achieve that as long as that resistor was of a sufficiently low value. That was another bit of, that network was another bit of EMI technology with us. Now, this valve is for the purpose of selecting this particular source. That is, there are 32 of these valves with all their cathodes connected together. And selection was done by means of what we called in those days a resistor tree. It was in fact a selection matrix. There were five bits to control the 32 sources and destinations. All selected binary wise. So by having 5 resistors there connected to the right inputs, only one of these 32 grids was higher than all the others, and that was the one which selected which source was being used. So if this valve was selected, then he pinched the current from all the other 32 cathodes, and this source operated, gave us information here out onto the source highway. Various bits of that circuit haven't been completed. I note I've put a value on that resistor, but never mind, it's meant to be about 10 milliamps up there.
5 minutes, thank you.
Right. Here is the destination. Destination gate, which is very similar to the source gate, except that in this case, this is the valve that does the selecting. Tree connection there. This network used here actually transfers the information from about plus 200 volts there down to about minus 200 volts here, this grid being at minus 215, and sending current either up that way or that way, depending. The input comes either from the clock pulse gate there or from the destination highway here, giving us an output here which goes on to the next part of the circuit. How did we get the information around the loop? I keep on getting mine upside down. We had a thing called a highway amplifier. The source highway there had 32 anodes on it, which were coupled, AC coupled, down into the cathode of this valve. The cathode impedance being something like 100 ohms, so that the stray capacity on here, well, taking into account all the 32 anodes, was fairly high, but looking into 100 ohms, it coped with it quite happily. So that current from those sources came up through this resistor, gave us about 20 volt signal there. This is an inverter, and the output here was DC restored, and this is what we call an assisted cathode follower. This is the cathode follower part with the output of the cathode. Downstairs here is a valve whose grid is AC coupled up to the anode of the top valve, so that this valve is responsible for pulling down this output, and this valve is responsible for pulling up. This being the destination highway, of course, there's quite a lot of capacitance on it, and this is one way of driving that capacitance. Right. And I have one circuit left. In the bistable trigger, we didn't need, in fact, a bistable trigger in the circulation unit of the mercury delay line, but we do need bistable triggers elsewhere, and this is a typical one. Here again we have that DC coupling network from the left-hand anode down to the right-hand grid, so that this grid can be at plus 10 or minus 10, say. If it is at plus 10, then all the current goes up the right-hand side here, the output. If it's at minus 10, all the current goes up the other way, which pulls this anode down, so it's a bi-state circuit. To turn it from one way to the other way, we have a pair of double diodes here. Clock pulses I've put here, but it could be any pulse coming in here. Positive, which sends current up here, and the current goes that way or that way, depending on where that grid stands. It goes to the left, it pulls down that anode, which switches the diode one way. If it goes to that anode, it pulls this grid down, which switches the other way. Right, those are typical circuits which I have selected. I'd like to say a few words about the ACE, which came later. The ACE was estimated to run something like 8 times faster than the pilot model, and this was due to a combination of things. One thing, the clock rate was 1.5 cycles instead of 1 length cycle. It had a much faster multiplier. It was capable of doing operations in every minor cycle. That is, it didn't waste time between operations. The pilot model did. And various other, it had much faster run on the ACE. One over here, which Fred Osborne will be describing this afternoon. Do I have any more time?
No, I think you're right.
Right. Okay, well, thank you very much. That's all the important things I wanted to say.
Thank you very much, David. We'll now break for lunch. As I say, the route is to go out of here, turn right through the space lab, through the space gallery, up the escalator, to the first floor for lunch. Be back here prompt for 1:45 news. Thank you very much.